Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we were taking a quiet journey into a world lit by candlelight and ruled by wonder. A world where every creak of wood and flicker of shadow carried a secret meaning. We're stepping into medieval Europe, where people crossed themselves before sleeping, where cats were feared, and where the moon was more than light. It was a presence, watching. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and step softly into that dim, smoky air. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like the faint hum of a church bell heard through mist and time. Before we begin, a quiet note. If you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of listeners scattered across the world, drifting off to the same tale under different skies. The medieval world was heavy with meaning. Every sound, scent, or sudden silence could be a sign, from God, from the devil, or from something older still. To live then was to live surrounded by invisible rules. A sneeze could open the soul to demons, so people would murmur, "God bless you," not as courtesy but as armor. A black cat slipping across your path was no accident. It was a whisper of misfortune. The ordinary was never merely ordinary. Imagine a small stone village at dusk. Smoke curls from thatched roofs. The scent of damp earth lingers in the air, and from the chapel window a faint glow spills across the muddy square. A farmer closes his gate and, before turning the latch, draws the sign of the cross in the air. He does it without thought, a gesture worn smooth by fear and habit. He believes that if he forgets, spirits might wander in. Superstition filled the gaps where knowledge could not reach. Illness came without cause, storms rose without warning, and shadows moved in corners where no one stood. People made sense of it the only way they could, by pattern and prayer. When the wind moaned down a chimney, it might be a warning. When a candle flickered, someone distant was dying. And when you felt a sudden chill, it was said that an unseen soul had passed right through you. Even the church, for all its learning, could not extinguish these old embers. Faith and superstition lived side by side, sometimes quarreling, sometimes embracing. A saint's relic could heal, but so could a scrap of iron hung over a cradle. A priest's blessing might drive away evil, but so could salt scattered across a doorstep or a cross carved into the lintel of a door. Belief was not singular. It was layered, like soot and incense over stone. In the half-light of medieval nights, fear was intimate. Firelight danced across walls, and the silence between the crackling logs felt alive. People spoke of spirits that slipped through keyholes, of fairies that stole newborns, of demons that pressed upon your chest as you slept. To guard against them, doors were bolted with prayers. Candles burned until the last one guttered, for darkness was not just absence, it was presence. There was comfort in repetition. The act of crossing oneself before stepping into the night, or whispering a charm before sleep, was not merely ritual, it was survival. For many, superstition was the soft thread tying their fragile world together. When crops failed, when a loved one fell ill, when thunder cracked across the sky, these small acts offered the illusion of control, the warmth of meaning in a cold universe. And meaning mattered. To break a mirror was to fracture the soul's reflection. To spill salt was to offend purity. To hear a raven croak at dawn was to be warned of death. Yet none of these beliefs felt strange to those who lived beneath that wide, trembling sky. They were part of a moral order, a delicate harmony between people and the unseen. There were things you simply did not do. You never pointed at a rainbow. It was God's bow, and to mock it was to invite misfortune. You never swept a floor after sunset, lest you brush away good spirits. If your ear rang, it meant someone was speaking your name. If a candle split its flame, it meant betrayal. Each gesture, each moment was part of a language shared across centuries, passed down through stories and warnings whispered at firesides. Superstition was not ignorance, it was imagination given shape by fear. In a time when death waited at every season's turn, when plague or hunger could arrive without reason, these beliefs were not madness, they were comfort. To believe that luck, fate, or God could be swayed by a word or a charm was to believe that life still held some mercy. Listen closely, and you can almost hear it. The murmured prayers as villagers sleep, the creak of shutters in the wind, the faint clatter of beads on a bedside table. The world outside is dark, but not empty. Every rustle in the thatch, every echo of hooves on wet stone seems alive with hidden intent. Somewhere, a church bell tolls midnight, slow, heavy, patient. Under the sign of the cross and the moon, medieval Europe dreams. Its people lie beneath wool blankets, whispering charms to keep their souls safe until morning. The fire dies to embers, shadows rise, and fear softens into faith. In that tender space between prayer and sleep, superstition breathes. The evil eye and other invisible curses. In every corner of medieval Europe, people feared being seen too closely, not in the modern sense, not the fear of gossip or judgment, but the deep, ancient terror that someone's gaze could harm you. They called it the evil eye, and it was said to pierce through skin and soul alike. It wasn't only witches or enemies who carried it. Anyone could. Even a friend could wound you without meaning to, if their admiration was too strong or their envy too sharp. A child too beautiful, a calf too healthy, a crop too green, all were thought to draw dangerous eyes. The belief crossed mountains and languages, from the salty coasts of Sicily to the misty fields of England, from Moorish Spain to the Rhine. People whispered of the same curse, the glance that took, not gave. It was an invisible theft of luck, of life, of light. Mothers tied bits of red thread around their babies' wrists. Farmers nailed iron horseshoes above their doors. Sailors hung coral from their masts. Iron was thought to bite back against the unseen, and coral, pulled from the sea's mysterious depths, was believed to confuse jealous spirits. If a stranger admired your child, you'd quickly spit on the ground and mutter, "God willing," to break the charm before it rooted. In the flicker of hearth fires, women whispered stories of the eyes that could make milk sour, spoil wine, or wither fruit on the branch. If a cow stopped giving milk, it wasn't poor feeding, it was someone's envy. If a newborn fell ill, the midwife would search the house for the one who had looked too long, too lovingly. The logic was strange but comforting. Every misfortune had a face, a cause. The unknown could be given shape, and then guarded against. Superstitions like this were not born from foolishness, but from fear wrapped in ritual. Imagine a world where disease could strike overnight, where one poor harvest could starve a village. To believe that an evil glance caused it was, in a strange way, to believe that the world was still connected, that intention had power, that human hearts could move the threads of fate. At night, homes glowed faintly with candlelight and charms. Over cradles, amulets swung, eyes carved from blue glass, crosses of ash wood, herbs tied with ribbon. Some hung tiny mirrors near windows, believing that reflection turned the curse back upon its sender. The idea that one could reflect malice was a poetic defense, evil undone by its own image. But there were darker ways to protect oneself too. Some carried toads in small pouches, believing their cold, dry skin could absorb harm. Others buried nails beneath thresholds, or burned bits of wool sprinkled with holy water. In some villages, if a person's stare brought too many accidents, they were quietly avoided, neither cursed outright nor welcomed near. Fear had a way of isolating the unlucky. It wasn't only peasants who trembled under this invisible gaze. In royal courts, kings wore rings of precious stones, cut to resemble eyes, sapphires and onyx meant to watch back. Queens embroidered talismanic patterns into their gowns. Even scholars, men of letters and theology, confessed that some eyes were poisonous. The evil eye sat comfortably beside angels and saints in the same mental map of wonder, and it lingered in language. To cast an eye was to endanger. Compliments came wrapped in disclaimers. To say, "What a strong child," without blessing it, immediately was almost cruel. So people learned to live carefully, balancing praise with piety. A whispered, "God keep you," was not just politeness, it was a shield. The church, of course, frowned on such ideas, calling them remnants of pagan thinking. But even priests carried charms in secret. Faith and fear were not opposites, they shared a roof. In sermons, monks spoke of humility as protection. Pride invited the devil. Envy opened the soul. And so, superstition wove itself quietly into morality. Modesty wasn't only virtue, it was safety. Picture again that quiet village night. A mother checks her sleeping child and adjusts the tiny blue bead above the bed. A cow lowing in the distance, a dog barking once. Outside, the moonlight touches rooftops like frost. Somewhere, a jealous heart stirs in the dark, but inside, the charm glints softly and the house breathes easy. For centuries, this belief persisted. The evil eye changed its form. Beads became metals, coral turned to silver, saints replaced spirits, but the fear stayed. Even now, you can find that same blue eye dangling from keychains and doorframes. A faint echo of medieval terror surviving in a modern world. Because superstition rarely dies, it just hides in plain sight, like an unseen gaze, watching from the edge of the candlelight. Curses, charms, and whispered words. The night is quiet, the coals are low, and breath hangs faintly in the air. You step with care, as if the floor itself could hold a listening spirit. Words, in the medieval mind, were not just signs. They were small, bright tools that pressed upon the world. A prayer could thicken the air around a cradle like warm cloth. A curse could thin it to drafts, letting in what should remain outside. People learned syllables the way others learn knots, each phrase a binding, each pause a loop. To speak properly was to arrange the world. To speak carelessly was to loosen it. In cottages, charms sat tucked into lintels and stitched beneath hems. They were short and spare, like well-worn steps. Cross of Christ before me, cross of Christ behind me. Bless the bread, bless the bed. Some were half Latin, half village, braided from church and hedge. A mother, wiping a child's brow, might whisper a rhyme while touching temple, chest, and belly in a slow, remembered pattern. The rhyme mattered, but so did the rhythm. Breath, touch, breath, a lullaby that told fear to sleep. Curses were the same craft turned sharp. A quarrel over a fence line could sour into muttered harm. The target's name was pricked into wax or scratched on a splinter of wood. The words were spoken crosswise, just under the breath, then sealed with spit. If a horse went lame the next week, blame followed the smoke trail back to that quarrel. A curse was proof that speech could bruise. People stored grudges like dry kindling. A single phrase could strike the spark. Not all speech stood naked. Many believed you must speak upon something for force. Salt grains on the tongue, a nail warmed in the hearth, a strip of linen torn from a death shroud. The material held the weight of the words as a cup holds wine. Iron was good for binding, beeswax was better for shaping, bread for blessing, ash for hiding. A charm written with soot on an eggshell could be broken and boiled into broth. The cure taken like a secret swallowed. The church tried to draw boundaries. Prayer, yes. Conjuration, no. But villagers skirted the line like hedgerow paths around a field. A priest might condemn vain words, then quietly hand a widow a psalm to recite at midnight for protection. Monks copied manuscripts where saints expelled demons with formulas that sounded, to lay ears, very much like spells. Between superstition and sacrament, the air was filled with murmuring. Think of the markets, clatter of wheels, crush of voices, chickens complaining in their wicker baskets. A peddler offers small scrolls inked with holy names. Another sells ribbon knotted 7 times for 7 pains. A lover buys a sprig of rue and ties it with blue thread. The knot tightened while whispering the beloved's name. If fortune smiles, the knot is kept. If not, it is cut in a field and turned 3 times to the east, letting the hope fall out like seed. There were songs for rain and whispers for sleep. Shepherds chanted to keep wolves from the fold. Sailors spat verses into the sea to soften a coming gale. When storms built on the horizon, grandmothers spoke to the clouds as if to unruly grandchildren. Not here, not now, pass over. It is easy to call this childish. Yet when the sky darkens like wet slate and the first cold drops strike, even skeptics count heartbeats. Speech steadies the hand. Names themselves were levers. To know the true name of an ailment, a river, a saint, was to hold a little handle on reality. People baptized boats and fields so that blessings could find them. They avoided speaking the names of certain spirits at night, the way one avoids rattling a door one cannot lock. In lullabies, you can still hear the tactic. Praise the baby softly, then mislead the listening night with talk of cats and wind so it wanders elsewhere. Some charms relied on silence. A vow kept secret was thought to ripen like fruit in a dark pantry. Break the silence and the sweetness spoiled, so clerks instructed anxious parishioners to bind their troubles to a quiet promise. 3 candles, 3 nights, no telling. If relief came, the vow was paid in bread to the poor or oil for the lamp. If relief did not, the vow was paid anyway, because promises were also a kind of fence. When words failed, they were written. On scraps of parchment, in cramped hands, letters marched like small soldiers. These briefs were tucked under pillows, worn in little leather cases against the heart, or sewn into sleeves. Sweat stained them, tears spotted them, the ink blurred, and still the bearer felt safer. If a fever spiked, the brief was dipped in wine and the patient given a sip. If a nightmare persisted, the parchment hung above the bed so the demon would read and depart, as polite visitors do when shown a firm notice. Of course, some words were forbidden. Blasphemies could curdle luck. Swearing oaths lightly was said to loosen the joints of providence. Things no longer fit so snugly after. Parents taught children to walk their sentences carefully, heel to toe over slippery stones. And there were days when no spells should be spoken at all. Holy Saturday, for instance, when even good words might sting like bees. You can measure a culture by what it whispers at night. In the hush after chores, families gathered like islands around their stoves. The father traced a small cross on the door. The mother counted beads. A grandmother mouthed something older than the church. Outside, the road lay pale under the moon, a ribbon toward the fields. A fox paused, listening, then moved on. The house exhaled. The words had done their work, whether or not anyone believed it by day. There were rules of timing, too. Dawn was a clean edge when charms caught. Noon was blunt. Dusk was porous. Many rites asked for odd numbers. 3 turns of thread, 7 grains of salt over the left shoulder, 9 quiet taps on wood. If the count slipped, you began again, because order mattered in a world that would not stay orderly. Thresholds were listened to. People spoke into door frames, neither inside nor out, so the words could choose a side. Lintels were chalked on holy days, bridges greeted with a line to please the river. In barns, a fever was untied by loosening 3 knots beside running water, the loosened cord carried away like a small spent snake. What remains for us is a music of breath and syllable, the human desire to lift a hand against the unsettlement of living. If a charm, stitched life together, even for a moment. It was not nothing. It was thread, and thread, in the right hands, becomes cloth. Cloth becomes shelter. Shelter becomes sleep. The candles sink, the room cools, and the tongue grows quiet. Keep a small phrase near, not because it rules the night, but because it steadies the part of you that walks through it. In the space between the last word and the dark, the heart learns its own gentle grammar. Witches at the edge of the woods. The coals breathe faintly, and the wind presses at the shutters. You steady yourself in the hush, as if stepping from the warm circle of a hearth toward the black trees beyond the lane. They lived, so the stories said, where smoke thinned to mist, at the last thatch, before the hedgerow, in a lean-to beneath the hill, or in a crooked hut where nettles clutched the door. By daylight, they were only old women, with earth under their nails and baskets that smelled of rosemary and damp leaves. But night-altered faces, the same eyes, lamplight caught, could look like two dark seeds, with roots sinking into secrets. Children were warned to pass quickly, men touched their caps, women crossed themselves and hurried their steps. The word witch gathered many shapes of human solitude. Midwives who knew the taste of iron in blood and the slick weight of a newborn. Widows who talked to their goats as if to friends. Herbalists who knew the moon's calendar better than any priest. Their craft was practical, a salve for burns that smelled of beeswax and plantain, a bitter brew for fever, yet usefulness frightened when it ran ahead of reason. When a cure came too swiftly or a prediction proved too sharp, fear found a shadow to stand in. Each village kept a quiet ledger of grudges, a cow that failed to calf, a child who sickened after being admired, a barrel of ale turned sour. Someone had to be the hinge on which misfortune swung. Eyes turned to the woman who lived apart, quick to speak, slow to bow, alone with her herbs and smoke. If she scolded a boy for theft and he fell ill, the story sharpened. If she begged and was refused, and hail soon bruised the barley, her muttering was remembered as a curse. Hear the night, as the tales do, owls grinding their soft gears in the rafters of the dark, twigs ticking together, the damp sweetness of leaf mold and rain. On such evenings, the mind invented company. Villagers pictured Sabbaths on hilltops, bonfires gnawing the edges of wind, dancers spinning until their feet lifted from the earth. Butter churned itself in the moonlight. Cats whispered, milk spoiled at the glance of an unseen guest. Dreams turned into doctrine. Yet the same mouths that gossiped also knocked at crooked doors when sickness came. A baby would not nurse, a husband shook with fever, an old ache returned like a ghost. The woman, though no one dared call her witch to her face, opened jars that filled the room with scent. Vinegar, smoke, lavender, tar. She ground roots until the air grew green and bitter, tied herbs with red thread, and spoke softly while steam rose from the cup. Her cures often worked, and that was precisely what frightened people most. The church tried to draw borders around faith, but even priests found the lines blurred. Monks warned against charms, yet saints' relics performed cures not so different from hedgecraft. Parishioners lit candles before relics and left coins on windowsills for herbs. Belief braided itself, half sacred, half soil, the rope both rough and smooth. Storms made everything worse. Wind raked the thatch, smoke backed into rooms, and livestock moaned as if naming their fears. When misfortune grew loud enough, it needed a voice to blame. The lonely cottage had one. Lanterns glowed like judgment in the dark as men tramped through mud, saying, "We only want to talk." Talk slipped toward threat. Confession was demanded for crimes that could not be named. What could she confess except the cruelty of weather and luck? Still, not every measure was cruel. Some protections were tender as children's games. A rowan branch above the door, scissors kept half open under a pillow, The hearth swept clockwise before sleep. Parents told children to hide their thumbs inside their palms when passing her gate, a small, secret fold against fear. Others were harsher, nails hammered into footprints, stones thrown at roofs, dead birds hung on doors. Fear has many dialects. Sometimes a man wore the blame instead, a shepherd whose flock thrived, a tinker who arrived too often, a recluse who sang to himself. But age, poverty, and solitude remained the favorite ingredients. The poorer the soul, the easier it was to imagine them rich in secret power. There were certain places stories always returned to: the bend of the road where trees leaned too close, the pond that held the moon like a bruise, the threefold crossroads. Witches were seen there because everyone feared hesitation, that single breath between choices. The unknown always hid at the fork in the road. Listen to her cupboard. Dry leaves rasp in clay jars. The scent of crushed nettle and honey hangs in the air. She hums softly, binding attention to her hands. A dab of salve on your palm, the instruction to warm it first. Teach your skin kindness before asking it to heal. You thank her, promise discretion, and walk home through fog. Still, a part of you feels the warmth of her remedy on your skin, long after the chill returns. Years might pass with only the small difficulties of living. Children grow, old ones fade. The same woman trudges to the stream, gathers mint, dries her herbs in bunches under eaves. People forget her name, but remember her touch, the cool fingers on a fevered brow. Even fear, eventually, tires of its own sharpness. The great hunts will come later, when law replaces rumor and bonfires light the sky. But in this softer century, the witch is rumor more than threat, neighbor more than monster. She stands at the edge of comfort and conscience, bearing what the village cannot admit to itself. Every age finds someone to hold its storms. Step back from the trees. The frost glows faintly. Your breath curls in the air, and somewhere behind you a single light goes out. The woods fold into darkness, and the path home smells of smoke, milk, and mint. Holy relics and the trade in miracles. The night stretches long, and the air feels older than stone. Somewhere far away, a bell tolls once, slow, patient, and hollow. In that sound lives a truth that every medieval soul understood. Between heaven and earth, there were objects that held power. They called them relics, fragments of holiness, pieces of the divine made tangible, a splinter of wood from the true cross, a vial of milk from the Virgin, a feather from an angel's wing. To touch such a thing was to brush the edge of eternity. But where there is power, there is trade. And in medieval Europe, relics became a currency more trusted than gold. Pilgrims walked for weeks, sleeping under hedges, feet wrapped in cloth, chasing whispers of miracles. They came limping and weeping, bearing candles, coins, and hope. The roads to Canterbury, Santiago, and Cologne glimmered with their faith and with their fear. For each step, they carried a silent question. Would the saint see me? Would I be healed? Inside the great churches, light trembled on gilt reliquaries. Gold and glass caught the flame of 1,000 candles. The air smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and incense. Behind iron grills, monks guarded treasures said to glow faintly when miracles occurred. A drop of blood from Christ, sealed in crystal. A shred of St. Catherine's veil. A tooth of John the Baptist, or 3, or 12, depending on which town claimed them. Relics were the bones of belief, and sometimes literally bones. Arm bones, jaw bones, finger bones. A saint's skull resting in a silver head-shaped casket. The faithful pressed lips to cold metal, believing a spark of grace would leap through. For many it did. Wounds closed, fevers broke, crops revived. The world still needed magic, and the church provided it, only now gilded, sanctified, wrapped in Latin. But faith has a marketplace. Along the pilgrim routes, Merchants sold tokens stamped with the image of each shrine, tiny lead badges in the shape of scallop shells or martyrs' swords. They jingled softly on tunics, proof that one had walked the holy miles. The further the road, the greater the protection they offered. Some hung them near cradles to keep children safe. Others melted them into drink as a cure for pain. Not all relics were honest. In the centuries, when every monastery wanted a saint, miracles became profitable. Traders scoured catacombs for bones to repackage as holy remains. A relic of St. Paul in Rome might have a twin in Paris and a third in Prague. Pilgrims rarely questioned it. To doubt the relic was to doubt hope itself, and hope, unlike truth, could fill a church. Imagine the scene inside a bustling cathedral on feast day. Candles shimmer like 100 small suns. Pilgrims crowd shoulder to shoulder, clutching rosaries. The relic is lifted high, veiled in smoke. A monk chants, his voice low and round like a wheel, turning through the centuries. A woman faints, believing she has seen light in the air. A blind man reaches forward and feels warmth pass through his palms. Whether miracle or moment, it is enough. Outside, the relic sellers call to the crowd. The saint's thread, the virgin's salt, a splinter of the cross, small but true. A boy runs between the stalls, his hand closing around a sliver of wood, no more sacred than a broom handle. But he believes, and belief itself becomes a kind of relic. He tucks it into his sleeve and walks home lighter. In the quiet hours of monasteries, there were those who doubted. One monk, charged with polishing the reliquary of St. Alban, wrote that the bones inside smelled faintly of horse. Another confessed to replacing a lost relic with bones from the kitchen. Yet even as they smiled at the absurdity, none dared call it false. If people found comfort, perhaps the comfort was holy. Relics blurred the line between faith and superstition. The same villagers who feared witches' herbs now sought saintly dust. Both offered protection. Both promised control over a chaotic world. The difference was only in the blessing of authority. One whispered at the hearth, the other sung from the altar. Still, relics held a poetry no sermon could rival. They were small, physical proofs that heaven might leave fingerprints. To hold a bone that once moved with purpose, to see silk that had touched a saint's skin, it made the divine less distant, and perhaps that closeness mattered more than the truth of it. At night, after the pilgrims left, the church would fall silent. Candles guttered out one by one. The relics rested in the dark, stripped of their spectacle, waiting. Dust settled on the glass. Wax cooled on the floor. Only the faint scent of incense lingered, sweet, smoky, eternal. Somewhere beyond the heavy doors, the wind moved through the graveyard grass. The faithful slept with their tokens under their pillows, dreaming of light and healing. And in those dreams, every relic worked, every fragment glowed, because belief itself, whispered softly enough, becomes its own kind of miracle. Dreams, birds, and burning candles. The night never ended cleanly in medieval Europe. It faded and flickered, like a candle guttering before dawn. Thin flame, thick smoke, and a world half asleep but still trembling with meaning. Dreams, birds, and candles. 3 small languages through which the unseen spoke. Each was ordinary, yet all were doors to another realm. Dreams came first, soft and weightless, but heavy with consequence. To wake from one was not to escape it. A vision of falling teeth could mean death. A dream of a river might promise fortune. To dream of a dog meant loyalty, unless the dog bit, in which case betrayal crept near. Monks copied dream books that mapped symbols like constellations, ladders, mirrors, apples, blood. Some said angels sent messages through dreams. Others warned that demons did too. The safest course was to wake slowly, remember carefully, and never speak the vision aloud before sunrise. A peasant might wake in the straw, heart pounding, recalling a dream of fire. He would walk to the door, spit 3 times, and whisper a prayer to Saint Joseph. the patron of good sleep. A noble woman, tossing in her carved bed, might wake with tears, having seen her husband drowned in a silver sea. The next morning she would send alms to a monastery, asking the monks to sing masses for his protection. Dreams, in their strange mixture of chaos and order, pulled everyone, poor and rich alike, into the same fragile belief that the night had something to tell them. Birds told stories too, but in daylight. To medieval eyes, they were divine messengers, their wings drawing invisible patterns of fate across the sky. Ravens were feared for their talkative hunger. Their croak near a door was enough to halt laughter mid-breath. A swallow's nest above the hearth brought good luck, for swallows were said to carry souls between worlds. Owls, those mute shadows of dusk, were omens of death, though some said they were just lonely monks in another form, condemned to sing their prayers forever in the dark. In fields, farmers watched the flight of crows before planting. If they flew straight, the season would prosper. If they scattered, misfortune brewed. Before battle, knights looked to falcons. If the bird rose clean and steady, courage grew in the breast. If it faltered, even armor felt heavier. Birds were the sky's handwriting, and everyone tried to read it. Then there were the candles, the simplest and perhaps most haunting of all signs. Fire was the only tame light in a world of shadow, and people believed it could speak. A candle burning with two flames meant a birth or a visitor soon to come. A flame that hissed foretold quarrel. One that bent low to the east warned of sickness. To snuff a candle by breath was to insult the angel that lived in its smoke. When someone died, candles were placed around the body not only for light, but to protect the soul's path, lest darkness devour it. Every home had its own lore. Some believed a candle that dripped to one side showed a friend thinking of you. Others said a candle that refused to die, no matter how long it burned, meant a soul nearby was begging for prayer. The flicker of flame was both comfort and warning, a heartbeat that might, at any moment, reveal another rhythm beneath it. Picture a small room at midnight. The thatch creaks, the cat shifts by the embers, and a single candle trembles on the table. A woman leans close, her face half gold, half shadow. She murmurs a prayer, then stares at the wick. The flame flares suddenly, splitting into two tongues. Her breath catches. Somewhere, far away, a messenger on horseback rides through the dark. News of a birth, a cry, or a death. The coincidence doesn't matter. What matters is that, for a heartbeat, the world feels briefly aligned, a signal received. Not every omen frightened. A robin at the window meant kindness was near. A white feather in the path meant peace. A dream of bread meant comfort. Of keys meant opportunity. Hope and fear shared the same grammar. People simply chose which meaning to hear. Even the clergy, who warned against idle superstition, were known to glance at candles during vigils or to pause when a bird flew through the cloister. Faith and folklore coiled together like smoke around flame, inseparable, perfumed, alive. In villages, when someone fell ill, neighbors watched for signs. If a sparrow struck the window, it was said the soul was preparing to leave. If a candle sputtered during prayer, another day would be granted. When words and medicine failed, the world itself was asked to speak. Through wings, through wax, through dreams. Scholars later called it irrational, yet there is tenderness in such attention, in believing that the wind, the light, the small motions of night might care enough to answer. To notice everything was, in a way, to love everything. The medieval heart, frightened as it was, refused to live in silence. As the last candle burns low, wax curling like pale petals, the room fills with a faint honey scent. Somewhere outside, an owl calls once, twice, then stops. You sit in the dark, the afterglow of flame still painted on your eyes, soft, trembling, almost human. In that small, fading warmth, you understand them. For who among us does not search for signs when the night grows too quiet? When shadows crossed the hearth evenings in medieval Europe always began the same way, the slow softening of the world. Fields turned to silhouettes, fires were coaxed awake, and the smell of wood smoke crept into every fold of wool and breath. The hearth wasn't only for warmth, it was a border, a glowing line that divided the safe from the strange. Everything beyond the circle of its light was uncertain. To guard that circle, people built invisible walls of habit and superstition. You never left bread upside down. It mocked the body of Christ. You never poured wine back into a jug after it had touched a cup, or you risked inviting envy into your home. And at day's end, before the last ember was banked, you whispered a small prayer, not to God exactly, but to the house itself. Keep us warm, keep us safe. The hearth was thought to hold a spirit, a quiet presence that watched over the family. In France, it was called the lutin du foyer, in parts of England, the brownie, and in the Slavic lands, the domovoi, small, invisible, sometimes mischievous, but rarely cruel. A bowl of milk was left overnight for them, or a crust of bread set near the ashes. Forget, and you might wake to find your fire dead, or your tools misplaced. To respect the unseen was good housekeeping. Every creak of timber and sigh of chimney wind was a reminder that homes were alive. The stones remembered, the beams listened. At night, when smoke coiled through the rafters, families told stories of the fires that burned too blue, a sure sign that a spirit had entered. Children held their breath until the color softened back to gold. Fire, after all, was a living thing. It could bless or betray. When someone died, the hearth was covered with cloth so the departing soul wouldn't be trapped in its warmth. The fire rested 3 days before being rekindled, and the first spark came from a neighbor, S hearth, because to light death, S smoke with one S own flame was to invite grief back. In such customs, tenderness and terror shared the same spoon. Small rituals stitched each evening together. Shoes were always left facing the door, not the bed, to guide good spirits out and keep bad ones from returning. Water left overnight was covered, for it was said that spirits washed their hands in it while people slept. Iron tools rested across thresholds to block whatever wandered. Even sweeping had its rules. You never swept after sundown, lest you brushed luck out into the street. The fire, though humble, commanded reverence. When the first flame caught, the oldest woman in the house often traced a cross above it and murmured blessings for health, for harvest, for peace. Children were warned never to spit into the fire. It would blind angels. And if a spark leapt toward you, you were to count 3 and whisper, "Someone's thinking of me." A strange comfort, but in a lonely age, even sparks could feel like company. Imagine the sensory world of such nights, the hiss of sap bursting from a log, the slow collapse of embers, the smell of soot and cooked barley thick in the air. A wooden spoon left in a pot hummed faintly as it cooled. A dog thumped its tail once, then slept. In that hush, the mind expanded. Small sounds, a drip from the roof, the sigh of an unlatched shutter, became the footsteps of invisible guests. Families marked holy days by the fire too. On Christmas Eve, the Yule log was lit from last year's ashes, binding the seasons together. On Easter, new fire was struck from flint outside the church, and each villager carried a spark home, guarding it from wind beneath cupped hands. The year was a wheel of light and smoke, turning slowly through centuries. Even gossip followed the fire's rhythm. Stories began when the flames were tall, laughter when they leaned low, confessions whispered when the room glowed red and faces softened. Secrets stayed in the chimney soot, it was said. To speak too loudly might draw them back down in sparks. So speech became gentle at night, like the fire's crackle, low, rhythmic, forgiving. There were darker tales too, of fires that refused to die, burning cold blue for nights on end, or of hearths that crackled names in the air. These were warnings, reminders that the line between comfort and curse was thin, but even fear had its routine. If your fire misbehaved, you sprinkled salt in the ashes and said nothing. Some things could be soothed only by silence. When dawn came, it arrived shyly, a pale light sliding down the chimney throat. The hearth, now gray and soft, waited to be stirred back into life. A woman knelt, drew a breath, and blew gently into the embers. The ash lifted like fog, the orange glow returned, and with it came the small, steady promise that life, however fragile, continued. We lived differently now, in rooms too bright for spirits. Yet somewhere deep in our habits, in the wish whispered before sleep, in the candle we light without reason, the old hearth still burns. It asks for nothing but attention, and in return, it offers something rarer than warmth, the feeling that the world, for a moment, makes sense inside a circle of light. Saints and spirits of the fields. Dawn begins not with light, but with breath, a thin mist exhaled by meadows, the soft damp on wool sleeves, the hush of soil loosening its night crust. In medieval Europe, fields were not mere acres to be worked. They were persons to be greeted, elders to be respected, sometimes children to be soothed. A farmer stepped from the threshold, crossed himself toward the east, and spoke to the furrows as if to relatives. Good morning, keep us. The earth had moods, the earth remembered. Before the plow bit, holy water was shaken from a sprig of boxwood across the team and beam, droplets striking oak and iron with tiny silver clicks. The priest had blessed that water on Sunday, yet it was the woman of the house who learned its weight, sprinkling a last bead over the seed sack so that no devil nor weevil would find welcome. Some tucked a small cross of rushes into the seam of the sack. Others stitched a saint's name in crooked thread near the drawstring. When a handful of seed spilled, it was never swept. It was buried at the edge of the field with a whispered apology, like a small funeral for the future. Saints walked those acres as surely as laborers. Saint Isidore, patient plowman, received muttered greetings whenever the blades snagged a root. Saint Medard watched the weather. Saint Barbara stood against thunder. Saint Blaise guarded the throats that sang in rain. On rogation days, the village spilled out in procession, children with green branches, men with banners, women with psalms, circling the boundaries like a slow river of voices. Fields were censed as altars, hedges smoked with incense, larks rose, startled, into the sweet haze of spring. A hymn was a fence you built with breath. Yet beneath the saints, older keepsakes turned their faces toward memory. At the field's corner, a stone no one could move. 3 oxen had tried, men had swore, wore a garland of straw, plaited by grandmothers. You never sat on that stone after sunset. You never laid iron on it. You never spoke ill of a neighbor within its hearing. In ditches, charms slept, a nail wrapped in linen for blight, a shard of mirror to reflect envy, a lump of salt sealed in wax against rot. Each charm was the size of a swallow's heart and hid like one, quick and invisible. When the first furrow opened, someone crossed the soil with bare feet, placing heel and toe carefully as if stepping onto a sleeping back. The skin of the earth knew warmth, people said. It liked to be greeted by flesh, not boot leather. Men spat thrice, women hummed, and a child clapped once to wake whatever friendly thing lived under clods and stones. If a skylark sang directly overhead, work paused. One listened. If it rose while the plow stood still, the day would favor you. If it circled a moving blade, better to rest and sharpen, lest the field take offense at your haste. Scarecrows were not simply guardians, they were negotiators. A cap hung on the stick was tipped at dawn, as if to an equal. A morsel of bread was tied to one wrist, a thimble of ale to the other. so crows might drink elsewhere and leave the wheat unpecked. In some hamlets, a bell of bent tin rattled from a willow branch. In others, bright rag strips fluttered like pennants for invisible guests. The wind read every ribbon and carried the message down valley. This field is spoken for. Haymaking had its sacraments. The first swath fell east to west, aligning sweat with sunlight. Scythes were wetted in running water and crossed, not piled, when set aside. To lay them in a heap invited accident. At noon, a crust was broken and tucked into the hem of a haycock for luck, though luck, being shy, preferred other names, for mice, for saints, for whoever walks late. If a blade bit a stone and rang, men touched the ground to apologize. Metal had a temper, earth had feelings. The day needed mending. At harvest, customs multiplied like stubble. The last standing sheaf was plaited into a woman's shape, the corn mother, the barley bride, and carried home on shoulders, singing. She was set beside the hearth and fed crumbs all winter, an honored guest whose silence held the next year's promise. In some places, the final sheaf was chased with playful cruelty. Whoever cut it received a splash of water or a smear of soot, an initiation reminding the cutter that no one harvests alone. Laughter pleased the spirits, joy fertilized as surely as dung. Boundaries required tenderness. Hedges were trimmed after Michaelmas, never before, because birds needed their berries and the poor their gleaning. Footpaths crossing barley were sprinkled with ash on feast days so travelers would step lightly. A gate left unlatched earned a mutter to St. Cuthbert and a quick walk back. You never invited the wandering things to wander where they pleased. If a hare bolted from the rows and doubled back, work stopped entirely. Hares were messengers, and a doubled path could not luck in a corner. Rain had its rights. Women beat the edge of a pond with willow switches to invite the sky's sympathy. Men turned a plowshare upside down to discomfort the clouds. When thunder rolled, everyone counted between flash and sound, then shouted St. Barbara's name into the wind. Failing that, a shoe thrown onto the thatch, sole upward, might coax the rain to rest. When the sun returned, children ran between hedges, yelping like puppies, as if to herd brightness back into the world. Blight required cunning. A ring of bread was passed over seedlings, then fed to birds so that sickness would fly with it. Nettles were planted at the field's edge to lure misfortune into their stings. If mildew kissed the leaves, a cross of ash was drawn on the palm and pressed to the ground. Take from hand, not from harvest. A lamb, born weak, might be walked along the headland at dawn, its hooves pricking the skin of the earth into compassion. Mercy was asked from everything. Everything sometimes answered. All winter, the fields slept like animals in their dens. Snow laid a clean sheet. Frost embroidered it with ferny script. Men scattered ash to sour the mouths of pests. Women planted garlic by the door so hunger would shy from it. Candlemas came, and wax tapped pots and posts in quick, bright blessings. On the first true thaw, doors were propped open and brooms leaned outward, the house breathing its dust into the lane breathing birdsong back inside. You could always tell a careful farm by its quiet. Tools hung with handles pointing down, sipping humility from the air. The well cover sang a small wooden tone when lifted. No rush, no clatter. Even the oxen learned the grammar. Step, pause, listen. Step, pause, listen. The careful farm angered fewer things and wasted fewer prayers. It needed fewer miracles. It saved them for children and storms. Of course there were skeptics, men who laughed at garlands and women who scolded saints under their breath. Yet even they paused at the boundary stone. Even they touched the head of the last sheaf. Tradition, like dew, wets even the boot that hurries. And perhaps disbelief requires its own rituals, the way a tired farmer presses both palms to his eyes at dusk, seeing fireworks flicker in the blood, tiny, private meteors, before turning toward the house. Night returns as it always does, laying a gentle hand on stubble and ridge. Bats write cursive over orchards. An eel turns in the mill race. A fox tests the wind for chickens and psalms. In the lane, the procession of rogation still seems to shimmer. The echo of green branches and old hymns, the lift and fall of human hope. Out in the dark, a field takes a deep, slow breath you can almost feel in your ribs. And you, standing at the gate, answer it without knowing, breath for breath, creature to creature, trusting that the saints and the small nameless spirits have heard enough to keep you through till morning, plague, and the search for scapegoats. The bell begins before the morning does, slow, iron, and deliberate, smudging the cool air with sorrow. Doors stay closed. Smoke climbs straight up, as if even the wind is holding its breath. Somewhere, someone coughs. Somewhere else, someone ties a sprig of rosemary to the door latch and whispers a psalm, careful not to wake misfortune that might already be listening. Plague names nothing and touches everything. It softens the knees of the strong and steals the sweet milk from cradles. It sits on thresholds, invisible, weightless, everywhere. When it walks a street, people learn to talk with their eyes. Bread changes hands on long spoons. Coins soak in vinegar before being touched. Neighbors pass in silence, brushing walls instead of each other. The city shrinks to islands of light, each window a small frightened planet. Priests call it punishment. Physicians call it poison in the air. Astrologers point to a quarrel between Mars and Saturn. Midwives bind rue and garlic to their wrists. Old men burn juniper, waving smoke into their clothes until they smell like bitter green fire. Faith, medicine, and superstition, 3 languages spoken in the same trembling breath. The processions begin. Barefoot penitents move through the narrow streets, chanting Kyrie eleison until voices merge into a low tide of guilt. Candles drip like wax tears. In some towns, men lash their backs raw to prove their repentance. Mothers shut windows and cover their children's ears. Pain, they say, can cleanse the air. The flagellants believe suffering has a scent that angels recognize. Chalk symbols bloom on doors. Prayers, warnings, counts of the dead. Straw smolders in the streets to purify the wind. The smell of vinegar and cloves clings to every step. Bells toll so often that silence itself becomes suspicious, like something holy that stops speaking. Fear breeds in the corners where reason falters, and when fear grows too heavy, it demands a carrier. Outsiders become convenient mirrors for the panic inside. A foreign merchant, a leper, a beggar at the well, all are accused. Most of all, the Jews. Old lies return, poisoned wells, cursed bread, secret meetings. Shops are looted, homes smashed, synagogues burned. Torah scrolls, those careful rivers of ink, are turned to smoke. Men who sold honey at the market yesterday now run for their lives. Fear, when dressed in piety, calls itself justice. Even lepers, who once moved through towns with bells to warn kindly of their approach, become symbols of sin. Their illness turns them ghostly long before death. The sound of their bells, once mercy, becomes alarm. A woman's gray hands reach for bread, and laughter follows her like stones. Rumor spreads faster than the plague itself, because rumor is easier to survive. Inside shuttered homes, people build their own defenses. Letters are held over rosemary smoke to cleanse the words. Shoes are left outside with their mouths open to the sun. Tools sleep in bowls of salt. Door rings are warmed with coals before they're touched. At dusk, when despair gathers in the alleys, families sing from windows. Voices climb together, fragile but brave, to confuse the angel of death and make him lose count. Doctors appear like crows, dark coats, long-beaked masks stuffed with mint, rose, and thyme. Their Latin is a curtain drawn against terror. They touch the sick with wooden rods, prescribe clean air, broth, and hope. Some bleed their patients, others offer prayer. Few truly believe either will work. When they leave, households bar their doors and whisper that the doctor himself might carry shadows beneath his cloak. Gravediggers labor under moonlight, their shovels whispering against soil. The ground forgets how to be dry. Bells toll until the metal grows warm. Priests bless pits instead of names. Children learn to recognize death by scent alone, wax, lime, and the faint sweetness of decay. If you are lucky, grief becomes manageable. A candle left burning, a loaf placed on the step for strangers, a name murmured over cold hands. Superstition takes root because it offers motion when everything else is still. People count the caws of crows, watch for dogs howling twice, note when a candle splits its flame. Housewives hang ivy for protection. Sailors taste the air to guess whether the disease has thinned. The more random the world becomes, the more the mind insists on patterns, even cruel ones. Yet not every custom harms. Fear, for all its ugliness, teaches cleanliness. Streets are swept, wells are sealed, windows open for the first time in years. Cities ban feasts and gambling houses. Quarantine arrives, 40 days of distance. It feels cruel, but soon mercy hides inside it. The sick are given space. The healthy learn restraint. Love begins to measure itself in how far it stays away. After the worst, the survivors look different. They blink at sunlight like animals coming out of burrows. Processions return, not of guilt, but of gratitude. Churches open, washed clean of smoke. A baker sets out bread again. A child laughs and startles himself. Cats rule the streets, sleek, indifferent monarchs of the living. And from a high window, someone replaces the old sprig of rosemary with a new one, because habit is a form of prayer. Years later, stories will be told. Some will say the plague made people cruel. They will be right. Others will say it made people kind. They, too, will be right. Between those truths stands a narrow bridge built of ordinary gestures, a hand steadying another, a bowl left outside a door, a candle still burning, though no one is sure for whom. If fear is a weather, faith becomes the roof, not perfect, not permanent, but enough to keep the rain off for a night. And when that night deepens, when the last bell finally falls silent, people will remember the same simple rules whispered across generations. Touch wood, touch water, touch someone you love. The world exhales. The city, exhausted, listens to its own heartbeat. For the first time in months, it sounds human again. Trials by fire and water. The human heart, when cornered by fear, often seeks proof, something visible to justify invisible belief. In medieval Europe, proof was not found in evidence or reason, but in ritual. When doubt gnawed at truth, when words clashed and witnesses lied, people turned to the oldest judge they knew, God himself. And to summon his verdict, they built a theater of pain called ordeal. The idea was simple and terrible. The innocent would be protected by divine power, the guilty revealed through suffering. God would not let the blameless burn, drown, or bleed unjustly. So the test was left to fire, iron, or water, the elements said to obey him. It was not cruelty in their eyes, but justice made visible. The first kind of ordeal was fire. Imagine a small church at dawn, incense lingering, candles shivering on the altar. Villagers gathered in silence. The accused, a man, a woman, a servant, stands barefoot on cold stones. A priest blesses an iron bar, glimmering red in the brazier. If this soul be guilty, he intones, may the flesh bear witness. The iron is lifted, pressed into the accused's palms for 3 heartbeats, then dropped. Hands are wrapped in linen, sealed, and left untouched for 3 days. When unwrapped, all lean close to see. If the wound is clean and healing, God has spoken mercy. If blistered and foul, guilt has been proven. Sometimes the iron was walked upon, laid across 9 glowing plowshares, before the altar. A man accused of theft would take 3 steps, each slower than the last. The congregation held its breath, watching smoke curl from his feet. He would not cry out. To do so would sound like confession. The smell of burnt skin mingled with wax and incense until judgment itself smelled of sorrow. Water, too, served as witness. The ordeal of cold water was reserved for witches, heretics, and the nameless poor who had no noble hand to defend them. Water, being pure, was said to reject sin. So the accused was bound and lowered into a pond or barrel. If they sank, they were innocent, though often dead before anyone could pull them out. If they floated, the water had refused them, and the crowd saw guilt shining in the ripples. Survival was treason against nature's verdict. Hot water offered another path. A cauldron boiled beside the altar. Within it lay a stone or ring. The accused reached in, gripping it from the bubbles, the flesh scalding white, then red. The arm was bandaged and inspected days later, just like the iron. Monks recorded these judgments with careful ink, noting miracles where skin healed unmarked. To them, justice was not human invention, but divine arithmetic, pain balanced against purity. Bread and cheese had their own trial. In the corsned, a suspected liar was fed a bite of consecrated bread. If he could swallow, innocence. If it stuck in his throat, guilt. The ritual was so feared that some fainted before the first bite. Priests whispered that God weighed words like stones in the chest. Those too heavy could not be swallowed. Each ordeal carried its own solemn beauty and its own madness. The crowd wanted to believe that heaven cared enough to act through fire and water. Without such faith, the world felt empty. So they stood close, weeping, praying, holding torches that smoked and hissed in the damp. Judgment Day condensed into a single morning, a single scream, a single wound. Over time, ordeals grew elaborate. In France, accused knights were sealed into barrels and rolled into rivers, trusting armor and angels alike. In the German towns, women accused of adultery walked 9 paces blindfolded between red-hot plowshares, guided only by the voice of a priest. In England, thieves swore oaths while holding molten metal in their hands. If their tongues blistered while speaking, the words themselves were condemned. Eventually, even the church began to flinch. Scholars whispered that miracles could not be scheduled, that God's silence might be mistaken for assent. Innocent blood began to feel too familiar on stone. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council quietly outlawed ordeals. Priests were forbidden to bless the instruments of trial, but habits die slower than laws. In the smaller villages, the rituals lingered. People still trusted elements more than judges. Fire and water had long memories. They would not forget their part so easily, and so the custom slipped underground. A widow accused of witchcraft might be tested by a pond at dusk, without priest or permission. A farmer suspected of theft might press his hand to an iron cauldron before swearing his innocence. The logic persisted, truth revealed by suffering, the soul visible only when stripped of comfort. It was belief's cruel poetry that purity glows brightest when burned, yet within this cruelty flickered a kind of faith too deep to vanish. People truly believed that the world itself could speak, that water could tell truth, that iron could feel sin. In that sense, the ordeals were not madness, but yearning, a desperate attempt to make the unseen visible, to touch justice with the hands. Imagine the church now empty, its floor scarred with heat. The brazier is cold. The pond outside still ripples where ropes once tightened. Wind hums softly through the eaves, and a single candle trembles by the altar, flame thin and uncertain. It burns not for guilt or innocence, but for the strange, stubborn hope that somewhere in the noise of pain, God was indeed listening. The music of bells and thunder. Before the age of clocks, time was sound. The bell ruled the hours. not merely as a tool, but as a heartbeat shared by the living and the dead. From high towers and weathered chapels, its bronze voice rolled across the land, marking prayer, harvest, danger, and death. And in the medieval imagination, bells did more than call to worship. They spoke to the sky itself. Each bell had a soul. It was baptized with holy water, anointed with oil, and given a name: Maria, Michael, Gabriel, Clara. When the rope was pulled, the faithful believed that not metal, but spirit sang. The ring of the bell was said to drive demons from the air, to frighten storm clouds, to scatter plague. Its sound, a mix of sorrow and command, linked heaven and earth with a single vibration. When thunder gathered, bells were rung in defiance. Peasants dropped their tools and ran to the church. The tower swayed as wind pressed against its stones. Lightning flashed across the thatch roofs below. Inside, the bell ropes jerked under trembling hands. "Ring it louder," shouted the priest. "Drive out the devil of the air." Each peal cracked through the storm like a prayer shouted at the void. It was not mere superstition. To those who lived by candlelight and faith, storms were not weather. They were tempests of divine mood. A sudden clap of thunder meant God's anger. Lightning that struck a barn was sin made visible. Bells were the human reply, bronze against cloud, courage against judgment. When the sound spread, villagers felt safer. Noise, at least, could not be struck down. Many bells bore inscriptions. Around their rims, carved Latin lines whispered, "I sound for the living, I mourn for the dead, I drive away lightning and storm." Some were melted from swords taken in war, a transformation of iron meant to prove that peace could sing louder than violence. Others were cast in secret, paid for by widows or guilds, their donations mixed into the molten metal so that their souls might echo forever. On feast days, bells rang like laughter. On funerals, they tolled low and slow, the air thick with their lament. For weddings they leapt, two tones dancing together. But the storm bells had their own rhythm, wild and desperate. To ring them was to risk death. Lightning often found the tallest tower first, running down the ropes into human hands. Many bell ringers died at their post, charred beside the ropes they pulled. Yet others took their place, because silence felt like surrender. In some towns, bells were given amulets of their own. Charms of wax and herbs were pressed into their clappers. Crosses were etched on their bronze throats. People believed that once a bell had rung during lightning, it became braver, its tone roughened with holy defiance. When storms loomed again, villagers would look up at the darkened sky and say, "Our bell has already faced worse." St. Barbara became the patron of thunder and fire. Her image hung near towers, and her name was carved into lintels of barns and bakeries alike. To call upon her during a storm was to plead for gentleness from a wrathful heaven. "Sweet Barbara, hold the flame in your hands," mothers whispered, clutching children under wool cloaks as the thunder rolled. "Carry it far from us." There were other customs. Some scattered blessed salt into the wind. Others drew crosses on doors with charcoal, believing lightning would hesitate before the sign. A loaf of bread, baked during a storm, was kept all year. A fragment tossed into the next storm's fire was said to quiet the sky. Every act, however small, was an answer to fear, a human note against the vast drumbeat above. Imagine the world of sound in those moments, rain hammering the roofs, the hiss of water running through gutters, the roar of wind through the trees, and beneath it all, the tolling of the bell, heavy, patient, pleading. The villagers listen, lips moving silently. They are not asking the storm to stop. They are asking to be remembered inside it. When dawn finally comes, the earth smells of iron and wet ash. The tower stands, blackened but proud. Birds creep out from hedges, shaking water from their feathers. Children run through puddles, laughing, while the priest examines the cracked bell with tender fingers. Its tone has changed, a deeper voice now, worn but faithful. The villagers nod, murmuring that it sounds wiser. Later that morning, as sunlight sifts through torn clouds, the bell rings again, not in fear this time, but in thanks. Its echo rolls down the valley, where sheep lift their heads and women open shutters to let the world back in. The storm is gone, but the sound lingers in the air like incense, a reminder that even thunder listens to persistence. Centuries later, when storms strike the same valleys, the old habit returns. People pause, counting the distance between flash and rumble, waiting for the familiar toll. Some churches have long fallen to ruin, but a few still ring, and the villagers swear the sky brightens sooner when they do. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's faith. Either way, the world seems to breathe easier for the sound. For every heart that has feared thunder, there is comfort in the bell, that gentle defiance, that patient song against the storm. It is the voice of humankind saying, "We hear you, sky, and we are still here." Lunar lore and the pull of the heavens. The moon in medieval Europe was more than a lamp in the sky. It was a clock, a calendar, a god's eye that opened and closed with time itself. Its pale glow touched every life, from peasants sowing barley to physicians bleeding patients to balance the humors. When it swelled full, people felt watched. When it thinned to a ghostly sliver, they felt the world withdraw into silence. The moon was mood, measure, and mystery. Each phase carried a different weight. The new moon promised beginnings, marriages arranged, houses built, seeds planted. Full moons were for harvests and childbirth, the times when the earth itself seemed most alive. The waning moon was unlucky, fit for ending things, but not for starting them. Even ordinary chores were shaped by its rhythm. Wood cut in a waning moon would rot. Milk drawn beneath a waxing moon would froth sweeter. So the almanacs taught, and so the people obeyed. Midwives carried their own lunar wisdom. A woman in labor during a rising moon, they said, would bring a strong child. During the dark moon, the child might be frail or fated for wanderlust. In candlelit rooms, women in travail counted not hours but shadows, their cries timed to the moving edge of light through shutter cracks. Some villages rang a bell for births that aligned with the full moon, a small celebration of cosmic symmetry. Others grew uneasy. Too much moonlight, they whispered, could blur the border between blessing and curse. Physicians were no less bound to its pull. Learned men at Salerno or Bologna turned their charts toward the sky before any operation. Bleed on the right arm when the moon is in Leo. One manual instructed on the left when it is in Aquarius. Lunar calendars hung in apothecaries beside bundles of sage and jars of honey, the neat geometry of the heavens dictating when to mix a potion or lance a wound. The stars wrote prescriptions long before any physician did. Astrologers, robed and solemn, read the moon as others read scripture. They saw in its face the balance between order and decay, between light and shadow. To them, the heavens were not distant but articulate, a page upon which destiny was penned in silver ink. Princes consulted them before wars, bishops before synods, merchants before voyages. If the moon's edge trembled red, they delayed. If it shone white and clear, they marched, sailed, or married. The entire world seemed to turn with its phases, like a tide drawn by something more than gravity. And yet, among the unlearned, lunar faith was not about stars or mathematics. It was about safety. A full moon lit the road home from the fields. It shone on fishermen mending nets and shepherds counting their flocks. But it also revealed what should have stayed hidden. Shadows sharpened, wolves howled longer, thieves favored its glow. People barred shutters more tightly under a red moon, fearing that spirits traveled freely when the night was too bright. In some regions, people whispered that the souls of the unbaptized wandered then, drawn to the light they were forever denied. Lunar eclipses stirred the deepest unease. When the bright coin in the sky suddenly dimmed, villagers fell to their knees, believing the world was ending. They banged pots, rang handbells, shouted prayers to free the moon from whatever beast had swallowed it. In chronicles, monks wrote solemnly of the dragon devouring the moon. Even kings trembled at that sight. For if heaven could be wounded, what chance did thrones have? But the moon did not only terrify, it comforted. It made the night less lonely. Travelers guided their steps by it, lovers met under it, monks prayed by its slow light across their pages, its glow polished roofs and rivers until everything shone with a borrowed holiness. In monasteries, the moon was called the nun of the sky, silent, devoted, repeating her cycle of obedience. When its silver edge touched the bell towers, the stone itself seemed to breathe. There was, too, a belief that the moon could draw madness from the mind. Lunacy, they called it, the moon's fever. Physicians wrote of how its rays pulled the humors upward, making the head too light, the thoughts too fast. On full moon nights, towns locked their gates early, hospitals doubled their watch. Yet for all their fear, they also saw beauty in it, a wild, restless energy that hinted at divine mystery. To be touched by the moon was to be both cursed and blessed, marked by something beyond reason. In certain corners of the countryside, farmers still turned their animals toward the moon on holy nights. Oxen were made to look upon it before plowing, so that the field might be straight. Fishermen spat toward its reflection for luck, a gesture both reverent and defiant. Lovers recited vows beneath it, convinced that silver light sealed promises more tightly than rings. If an oath was broken, it was said the moon remembered, and would one day tell. Centuries of ritual gathered beneath that soft light. Even the church, cautious though it was, could not banish the moon's quiet dominion. Feast days followed its calendar. Easter itself was determined by its cycle. Monks calculated its movements to set their prayers, yet still glanced upward with the same wonder as shepherds. The moon united the learned and the lowly, both humbled by the same pale coin of the night. Picture the final hours before dawn, fields glazed in frost, a river turning like pewter, a thatched roof glowing faintly. Somewhere, a man looks up, his breath hanging like mist, the moon poised above the horizon, enormous, patient, perfect. He does not think of science or sin or cycles. He simply feels the pull, the steady rhythm between heart and sky. The moon stares back, cool and merciful. For a moment, the world feels arranged, and even the darkness behaves. Animals with hidden meanings. When dawn crept into a medieval village, it was not clocks or calendars that greeted the people first, but animals. The rooster's cry cracked the silence, dogs barked at unseen things, oxen groaned in their stalls, sparrows fluttered through smoke holes, and every sound carried meaning. Life, in those centuries, was an orchestra of omens. Each creature was a messenger, whether it meant to be or not. To live among animals was to live inside a scripture without words. They were mirrors of virtue and vice, heavenly lessons written in fur and feather. The bestiaries, those richly painted books copied by monks, told it plainly. The lion symbolized Christ, majesty, the fox deceit, the pelican sacrifice, the owl sin and solitude. Each page shimmered with color and faith. Gold leaf pressed around animals that most peasants would never see, but somehow understood instinctively. The natural world was not separate from belief. It was belief in motion. But beyond the monastery walls, among the cottages and barns, meanings turned more intimate. The rooster, proud and red-crowned, was not just a preacher of dawn. He was a guardian. His crow was thought to scatter demons, his blood to cure blindness. Churches placed roosters atop their steeples, not for decoration, but to keep watch. When he crowed at odd hours, people listened closely. A third crow after sunset might warn of death. A sudden silence at dawn might mean birth. Between each cry, hearts measured their own luck. Dogs were both beloved and feared. Their loyalty was sacred. Saints were said to walk with them. Yet their howls pierced the veil between worlds. A dog howling 3 times before midnight meant a soul was leaving the village. To see one dig at the ground was to be reminded that the dead still asked for prayers. Even monks wrote that Christ himself came as shepherd so that faithful souls might bark rather than speak. And still, if a dog refused food or stared at an empty doorway too long, people whispered that it saw something human eyes could not. Cats lived a stranger fate. Worshipped once in Egypt, they now prowled the margins of medieval imagination, half companion, half suspect. Their glowing eyes in the dark unnerved people, especially women who lived alone. It was said that witches sent their spirits into cats to wander at night, stealing milk from cows or breath from sleeping children. Yet no village could do without them. They kept barns free of rats, hearths free of snakes. So people practiced a wary gratitude. Feed the cat, but do not praise it too loudly. Pet its back, but never its tail. And if it sleeps by the fire facing the door, expect visitors by morning. Birds spoke in a lighter tongue. The swallow that nested under the eaves brought luck. To kill one was a sin that could rot your roof. Crows and ravens, black as confession, foretold death when they perched on crosses. But if they flew low over a field, it meant the harvest would be good, the earth feeding even its mourners. Doves, white and soft, were the soul's symbols, released at weddings and funerals alike. To see one circle thrice before leaving was to know a prayer had been accepted. And owls, those grey monks of the night, stirred unease. Their call, hollow, deliberate, was said to echo the cry of the damned. Still, some hermits listened gladly, hearing in it the wisdom of solitude. Cows and sheep carried their own quiet holiness. A cow that knelt in her stall on Christmas Eve was said to be praying. Shepherds watched the patterns of their flocks. If sheep turned all one way at dusk, fair weather. If they wandered restless, storm. The ram was strength, the lamb innocence, and in every pasture the steady chewing of animals felt like the heartbeat of patience itself. Horses bridged heaven and earth. A white horse was sacred, touched by angels. A black one might carry spirits. To dream of a horse running free was to receive good news. To dream of one limping was to prepare for grief. Knights treated their steeds as comrades, whispering blessings before battle. Monks recorded tales of saints who calmed wild horses with a single touch. And when a horse died, some villages held small rites, burying a lock of mane under the stable door, so its spirit would keep the next animal from fear. Pigs, creatures of appetite, were both mocked and needed. Their flesh fed winter, their snouts found truffles like buried treasure. But superstition warned against letting one cross your path on the way to market. It meant loss. If a pig squealed suddenly at night, the devil was walking nearby. Yet their presence in every courtyard reminded people that even greed, when tempered by need, had a place in creation. Wild animals blurred the boundary between the known and the wondrous. Wolves were the devil's dogs, yet they were admired for their cunning and loyalty to their pack. To see one at a distance meant protection. Too close, destruction. Deer, fleet and silent, symbolized purity. Legends told of white stags leading hunters toward revelation. Snakes were evil, of course, or healers, depending on the telling. Their shed skin was used as charm against fever, but only if found before sunrise, and never by chance. Frogs croaking in spring meant the land was waking. Bats fluttering from a barn meant rain. Even insects spoke. Bees were the soul of the hive, thought to understand human sorrow. When their keeper died, they had to be told, or they would leave in mourning. To knock on the hive and whisper, "Your master is gone, but the flowers still bloom," was both farewell and promise. The medieval mind did not separate affection from awe. People lived close enough to smell the breath of their animals, to share warmth and danger alike, and in that intimacy, every gesture became a sign. When an ox turned its head slowly, someone's luck was changing. When a rooster scratched with its left foot, an unexpected guest was near. The world seemed to speak endlessly, not through miracles, but through motion. And yet, beneath the fear and fable, there was a quiet reverence. Each creature carried something human inside it: hunger, loyalty, wonder. To live among them was to live inside a choir of lowing, cawing, chirping prayers. Even now, in the faint echo of a dog's howl or the flash of a bird's wing, we hear that same ancient language, the conversation between survival and soul. Night falls again. The cat curls on the hearth. The owl lifts its soft voice. The horse stamps once in the dark. Somewhere in the woods, a fox laughs, quick and silver, and for a heartbeat, the world feels full of meaning again, as if every living thing still remembers what it once tried to tell us. Crossroads and coffins. Midnight was never merely dark in medieval Europe. It was directional. Every road, every lane that crossed another carried an invisible weight. Crossroads were the arteries of both travel and belief, the meeting points of heaven, hell, and whatever wandered in between. When the wind moaned through their open spaces, villagers said the dead were whispering directions. A traveler walking alone at night was warned never to pause where two paths met. The ground there was restless. Some said the devil waited at crossroads in disguise, offering shortcuts, not to destinations but to desires. Others claimed angels passed by unseen, counting souls who had lost their way. To cross yourself there was a reflex, not a thought. Burial at crossroads was punishment and protection in one. The unbaptized suicides and criminals were often laid beneath those intersecting ruts, denied the consecrated safety of churchyards. The reasoning was strange but consistent. The soul, confused by four directions, would wander in circles and trouble no one. Stones were piled atop the graves to keep them still. Sometimes a stake was driven through the chest, pinning body to earth like parchment to a desk. At dawn, travelers passed quickly, pretending not to notice the small mounds that seemed to breathe. Coffins, too, were guarded by ritual. Before the lid closed, salt was sprinkled in the corners, the element of purity, meant to preserve not just the flesh, but the memory. Coins rested on eyelids to pay for the passage across whatever river awaited. If the dead had wronged someone, a knot was tied in their shroud to bind vengeance. When the coffin left the house, it was turned 3 times so that the spirit would forget the way back. Children watched from behind skirts, learning fear through imitation. The procession to the grave was a map of sound, the bell tolling its slow measure, the psalms rising like fog, boots sinking into mud. The path wound through fields where crows gathered, and every bird's cry was taken as omen. If they flew east, peace; if west, unrest. The coffin was never set down once it left the door. To rest it on the earth was to tempt the soul to stay. At the cemetery gate, mourners paused. The priest murmured blessings, and the grave diggers crossed their tools, iron making a silent prayer. When the first shovelful of soil struck the lid, some turned away, others leaned closer, listening for a sign. If the ground swallowed the sound quickly, the dead were content. If it echoed, like drumming on wood, the soul resisted. A single candle burned until the last word was said. Its smoke, curling into the cold air, was said to show the soul's direction, whether up, down, or sideways into memory. Yet not every burial found its end. The medieval imagination was haunted by movement, coffins that creaked, graves that sighed. It was believed that restless souls might rise to finish unfinished tasks, debts unpaid, promises broken, words unsaid. To keep them still, nails were driven through the hems of shrouds, rosaries wrapped tightly around the wrists. Sometimes bottles filled with holy water or bits of parchment bearing psalms were buried with the dead. The spirit, thirsty for redemption, might drink and sleep. Superstition surrounded even the graveyard walls. To lean against them carelessly was to invite melancholy. To step inside after sunset was to trespass among watchful company. Lovers carved initials into the bark of churchyard trees, believing that love sealed there would endure beyond death, for the dead themselves were witnesses. But others feared the same trees, saying roots fed on the bones of sinners and whispered their names in the wind. The cross at the grave's head faced east, toward resurrection, toward light, but those buried at crossroads faced nowhere. Their souls, it was said, wandered under the moon, seen sometimes as faint blue flames dancing in the distance. People called them will-o'-the-wisps, thinking they were spirits playing tricks on travelers. Scholars now say it was gas from the soil, but to the medieval traveler it was enough to turn back, heart-pounding, whispering prayers to Saint Michael, the guide of souls. Wakes, held before burial, were as much for the living as the dead. Candles were kept burning all night beside the body, so no spirit, human or otherwise, could claim it. Neighbors came with bread and ale, telling stories, laughing too loudly to keep silence from settling. Every creak of the coffin was greeted with another prayer. When the candles guttered low, someone would light them again without hesitation. Darkness was never allowed to win, not even for an hour. The materials of death carried their own meanings. Coffin wood from oak promised peace, from willow, forgiveness, from pine, a quick passage. Nails were driven in odd numbers, 3, 5, or 7, to mimic the sacred. A hammer drop in the wrong rhythm could make a mourner gasp. Everything had order. Even grief had its own mathematics. There were practical fears too. When plague swept towns, so many were buried, the churchyards swelled and spilled. Mass graves blurred individuality into geography. Crossroads took the overflow. At night, travelers heard the ground settling, a deep, soft sound like distant surf. They walked faster. Some tossed a coin over their shoulder for the lost. None looked back. But death was not only terror, it was continuity. Candles burned on windowsills during anniversaries. Flowers, wild, not bought, were left at mounds without names. Children grew up tracing crosses into dust, not knowing whose dust it was. The living learned to coexist with the dead, to share roads and rumors alike. Every step on a cobblestone, every whisper of wind through grass was a reminder that peace had to be maintained through gesture, not certainty. If you could stand at a medieval crossroads in the hour before dawn, you might hear all of it at once. The low toll of a distant bell, the soft cry of an owl, the rustle of travelers avoiding eye contact with the ground. The roads gleam faintly, silvered by moonlight, and for a moment the four directions seem to breathe. Somewhere beneath your feet, old bones lie dreaming of names forgotten. Somewhere above, the sky waits for its next question, and you, between them, stand very still, realizing that even in the middle of nowhere, the world listens. The devil's marks. In a world where illness, misfortune, and strange birthmarks needed meaning, the body itself became a battlefield between heaven and hell. Medieval Europe read flesh as scripture. Every mole, scar, or freckle could be an omen, a blessing, or a curse. When the church taught that the soul was written on the skin, people began to look at one another differently. With reverence or suspicion, they called them marks of the devil, not because they glowed or burned, but because they resisted explanation. A wart that returned after prayer, a patch of skin that felt no pain, a bruise shaped like a crescent moon, all invited whispers. The inquisitors said that Satan branded his servants like livestock, sealing pacts in flesh. So when calamity struck, a cow dead, milk soured, rain withheld, eyes turned not to the sky, but to the skin of neighbors. The witch hunters of later centuries would turn this belief into an industry, but its roots ran deeper, into the peasant fear of difference. People wanted the world to be legible. Every blemish needed a reason. Birthmarks explained fate. A mole near the mouth foretold hunger or lust. On the hand, greed. On the heart, sorrow. To be born with 6 fingers was to carry a sign of special power or of infernal touch. Midwives with trembling fingers counted digits, traced freckles, murmured prayers for innocence. The examination of skin became a ritual of both faith and shame. Suspected witches were stripped and shaved so that no charm or curse could hide. Their bodies were prodded with needles, searching for numb places that did not bleed. The devil's teat, they called it, a small spot, often nothing more than a scar, believed to feed imps or demons invisible to the naked eye. If the needle found no pain, the soul was judged guilty. Many confessed under such tests, not because they believed, but because the alternative was worse. Yet not all marks were condemned. Some were revered. The stigmata of saints, wounds mirroring Christ's, turned suffering into holiness. Blood seeping from palms, feet, or brow was read as proof of divine favor. Crowds gathered to see them, to touch the cloths that caught their blood. The same culture that burned witches for bleeding in strange ways adored those who bled in sacred patterns. Holiness and heresy were separated only by context, by who was watching and by who suffered. There was a language of protection, too, written on skin with intention rather than birth. Pilgrims tattooed small crosses on their wrists before traveling to Jerusalem, so that if they died abroad, they would be known as children of faith. Soldiers carved saints' initials on their arms before battle. Mothers traced wet ash on their children's foreheads during storms. Skin was a door, they believed, and marks were locks or keys. Left-handedness carried its own unease. The left side was sinister, the word itself a warning. To use the left hand for blessing or greeting was to mock divine order. Children born left-handed were quietly trained to favor the right, their natural gestures pressed into obedience. And yet stories survived of clever left-handed scribes, musicians, and swordsmen, the devil's chosen, who outwitted the world by accident of birth. Freckles and red hair, too, bore suspicion. Red was the color of fire, and of Judas's beard in painted altarpieces. Women with hair the color of embers were admired and avoided. Too close to flame, people said. In them, beauty and danger mingled like sparks in straw. Some men swore that a red-haired woman could charm bees or curdle wine with a glance. The church warned against such gossip, but whispers travel faster than sermons. When medicine began to stir from its medieval sleep, scholars tried to reclaim the body from mystery. Physicians mapped veins, named organs, studied blemishes as signs of humors instead of devils. But even they worked by candlelight, their scalpel a sacred instrument, their curiosity edged with fear. To cut the skin was to trespass on divine territory. Still, curiosity grew, quietly, bravely, in the dim glow of apothecaries and anatomy halls. And yet the old ways lingered. When a child was born with a dark birthmark, mothers touched it thrice with holy water. When a mole appeared after a dream, it was covered with cloth until the next full moon, lest it spread its meaning. A sudden scar was read as memory of sin. People carried mirrors not only to see, but to check for signs that heaven had changed its mind about them. Think of how fragile it all was, how the body became confession, each mark a sentence, each freckle a syllable in a story written without consent. Even love had to read carefully. A kiss near a mole might bless or condemn. The medieval heart learned to love around its own fears. tracing patterns that no one else could see. But superstition, like ink, fades slowly. Centuries later, when science finally scrubbed the body clean of spirits, some of those old whispers survived. We still speak of lucky freckles, cursed hands, the mark of Cain or of destiny. The mirror remains a witness, the skin a page. The old belief lingers in the way we still call beauty marks. In the quiet of an evening candle, the logic of it almost makes sense. When words were few and illness common, when the unseen ruled every life, people needed their bodies to explain the world. The devil's mark was never really about evil. It was about meaning. To find a sign, even a dark one, was to believe that suffering had order. So they watched one another's faces by firelight, searching for signs of heaven or hell in the freckles and scars, and sometimes, for a heartbeat, mistook love for salvation. Cures stranger than the illness. When medicine is powerless, imagination becomes the remedy. And in medieval Europe, where doctors spoke more Latin than sense and prayers often replaced prescriptions, imagination healed more than science ever could. A good cure was part ritual, part poetry, and part hope. The worse the disease, the stranger the cure, because faith, like fever, demanded intensity. Illness was everywhere. The air itself was suspected of sickness. Bad smells were thought to carry plague, and a chill breeze could undo the strongest man. Physicians explained disease through humors, the four invisible fluids of life: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To fall ill was to fall out of balance, and the goal was not to destroy the sickness, but to rebalance the soul. From that fragile idea bloomed 1,000 methods, both tender and terrible. Bloodletting was most common. The logic was simple. If the body burned, release the heat. Patients were cut behind the ear, on the arm, at the ankle. The blood ran into bowls as priests whispered blessings. Some fainted, some revived, some died quietly, their balance restored only in death. Leeches were gentler executioners. Apothecaries kept them in small glass jars, feeding them with drops of wine. A leech placed on the skin could drain both poison and anxiety. Let the creature drink your anger, one manual advised. The patients believed it did. Then came the cures that belonged entirely to faith. For fever, a page of scripture steeped in wine and swallowed whole. For toothache, a mouse roasted in oil and rubbed on the gums. For madness, a crown of baked clay soaked in holy water and worn through the night. Monks recorded recipes that mixed prayer and pharmacy. Grind viper flesh with sage, say the Lord's Prayer thrice, and the afflicted shall rest. It sounds absurd now, yet these gestures were less about logic than comfort. Small performances of control in a world ruled by accident. Certain relics were said to cure anything they touched. A pilgrimage to St. Roch's shrine could ease pestilence. St. Apollonia guarded teeth. St. Vitus, trembling limbs. Bones, water, wax, and song, all were prescribed with equal confidence. When even saints failed, villagers turned to hedge healers and cunning women. They read the illness like weather, watching the patient's breath as one reads clouds. Herbs hung in doorways, salt circled beds, smoke coiled around fevered heads. The healer's hands were cool, her murmurs rhythmic. She didn't claim to understand disease, she persuaded it to move on. There were charms for childbirth, knives laid under pillows to cut pain, keys hung at the foot of the bed to unlock the womb. For gout, a wolf's tooth worn around the neck. For melancholy, a mixture of honey and crushed emeralds, though only the rich could afford to swallow gems. For blindness, a mixture of egg whites and powdered pearls, gently smeared on the eyes while reciting the creed backward. For the plague, air fumigated with rosemary, lavender, or, if desperate, dung from a white cow fed only on violets. Animals themselves became medicine. a pigeon split in two and laid warm on the chest for lung pain, a live frog placed against a throat swollen by infection. The logic was sympathetic: life to draw out death, movement to draw out stillness. In some regions, spiders' webs were packed into wounds to net evil spirits. In others, a black cat's tail brushed across boils to charm them away. Cures demanded participation from all of creation, and always there was timing. Herbs gathered at dawn worked best for bleeding. Those cut under moonlight soothed the mind. Rainwater collected during storms healed burns. Dew caught on Easter morning eased heartbreak. The number 3 was sacred. 3 prayers, 3 sips, 3 days of rest. The rhythm of healing matched the rhythm of faith. Repetition until belief returned. In the city, professional healers grew bold. Apothecaries bottled potions tinted with crushed lapis, coral, and gold leaf. Wealthy patrons bought elixirs promising eternal youth, each drop bright as sin. Doctors prescribed unicorn horn powder, actually narwhal tusk, to neutralize poison. Snake stones, bezoars, and the heart of a toad, dried in sunlight, became priceless commodities. The line between medicine and magic blurred into a kind of alchemy of hope. And hope was the real cure. Many recovered not because their bodies changed, but because their fear did. A fever soothed by touch, a wound eased by prayer, a heart steadied by rhythm. Healing lived in the space between belief and breath. Even when the cure failed, the ritual endured. To be cared for was itself medicine. Still, desperation had darker edges. Exorcisms were performed for illnesses of the mind. Priests shouted Latin over trembling bodies, sprinkling holy water until walls dripped. Candles were placed on bellies, relics pressed to skin. Sometimes the patient quieted, whether by exhaustion, suggestion, or surrender. No one knew. Sometimes they died mid-prayer, and people nodded grimly, saying the demon was strong. Medicine advanced in monasteries, herbs catalogued, remedies copied, reason slowly awakening under candlelight. Yet even scholars found beauty in the old strangeness. They wrote that fear itself was poisonous, and faith its antidote. Let the heart be tranquil, one monk advised, for peace quickens the blood. The sentence could have been poetry or science. In those centuries, it was both. When night fell over a sick room, the rules softened. The doctor gone, the priest asleep, only the patient and the watchful mother remained. She dipped cloth into wine, wiped the forehead, whispered fragments of half-remembered charms. "Sleep now," she said, though the words were really for herself. The candle trembled on the sill, wax pooling like slow tears. Outside, an owl called, and the air felt briefly clean. Cures stranger than the illness, yes, but perhaps not stranger than the times. Beneath the superstition lay tenderness, the refusal to accept suffering without ceremony, the need to make pain meaningful. For every absurd recipe or impossible charm, there was love disguised as ritual, a human attempt to turn fear into action, to tell sickness, "You are not the only force in this room." Monks, scholars, and skeptics. The candle of reason burned slowly in the medieval world, thin, flickering, and always at risk of being blown out by faith. Yet even within monasteries, where obedience was law and mystery sacred, small embers of curiosity began to glow. The monks copied prayers, yes, but also medicine, geometry, and the stars. Between lines of scripture, they left room for questions. Every monastery had its scholar, a man who stared too long at the margins of a manuscript, wondering not only what God wrote, but why. He measured shadows with string, counted the wings of flies, timed the echo of bells. His brothers shook their heads, but left him be. Curiosity was a quiet vice. It made little noise in the cloister. In libraries, among the smell of parchment and candle smoke, men began to sense that superstition was not the only language the world spoke. They read Aristotle in secret, the forbidden Greek rediscovered through Arabic translations carried by merchants and crusaders. His logic was a revelation. Nature followed order. Fire rose because it must. Stones fell because of weight, not wrath. To believe this was not to deny God, but to see him as lawgiver rather than magician. Still, to say such things aloud was dangerous. Faith demanded wonder, and reason risked stealing its music. Outside the monastery, the universities were forming. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, new worlds of ink and argument. Students crowded into dim halls where masters lectured with voices echoing like sermons. They debated whether comets were signs or substances, whether dreams came from demons or digestion, whether laughter was divine or base. Theology was still queen, but philosophy had crept into her court, sly and smiling. Yet the old fears remained. When plague returned, scholars still prayed first and measured later. When thunder cracked, even the learned crossed themselves. The habits of centuries clung like dust to robes. It was safer to add explanation than to replace it. God made fire rise, but perhaps he used cause and effect as his servants. Superstition began to evolve, shedding feathers for facts, but keeping its bones of awe. The monks who studied the natural world did so with reverence. They wrote of herbs as if describing saints, each plant a parable. The violet humbles itself, one wrote, and therefore comforts the sorrowful. The nettle stings the idle, but spares the diligent. Healing and holiness were twin branches of the same tree. Knowledge was devotion, so long as it bowed its head. There were skeptics even then, not the loud deniers of later centuries, but gentle doubters. They asked whether relics could truly heal, or if the miracle was faith itself. They wondered why two saints' bones could cure opposite illnesses. Some kept their doubts to themselves, scribbling marginal notes that read only, perhaps otherwise. In those two words, an age of reason began to breathe. The church, for its part, was torn between suspicion and pride. It saw knowledge as a flame to be guarded, not spread. Yet every guarded flame still gives light. Monks who observed eclipses or charted tides became accidental scientists. Astrolabes gleamed beside crucifixes. Manuscripts of Galen sat beside the Psalms. The sacred and the sensible coexisted like twin bells, ringing the same hour from different towers. Some scholars tried to translate mystery into pattern. The Benedictines recorded rainfall. The Cistercians built canals that turned marsh into meadow. To understand creation was, they said, to praise it more deeply. God, being perfect, must have built a perfect order, and the task of man was to read it, not to tremble before it. They mapped stars, named minerals, dissected fish. Each discovery felt like a hymn written backward, understanding as worship. Still, not all welcomed these changes. Superstition was comfort, and comfort is hard to surrender. When a monk declared lightning natural, an old abbot reminded him, "Yet it still strikes sinners first." Both smiled, neither truly convinced the other. The world was wide enough for both views, for science and for sign, for reason and for reverence. Printing, when it arrived, spread books faster than priests could bless them. Ideas escaped monasteries like birds through broken windows. Theologies grew nervous. The sky, once the throne of angels, became a stage for planets. But the earliest skeptics remained humble. They did not mock belief. They refined it. They sought to understand God's handwriting, not erase it. Imagine one of those monks now, in his narrow cell. He bends over a parchment, his quill whispering. Outside, thunder murmurs. He pauses, half in fear, half in thought. The old instinct makes him cross himself. But then he listens closer. The thunder repeats at a distance, a rhythm, a pattern. He smiles faintly, and notes it in the margin, perhaps a law of air. The candle flickers, but the flame endures. By morning he will have copied another sermon, another hymn. His doubt will remain hidden in the spaces between letters, invisible yet real. Centuries later, his quiet courage will echo in laboratories and libraries. The skeptic was not a rebel. He was a believer who refused to stop asking. And so, the world of superstition began to thin, not by denial, but by curiosity. Knowledge did not destroy wonder. It polished it, revealing its true reflection. Faith remained, quieter, wiser, perhaps lonelier. But when the next storm came, some looked to the sky and saw not wrath, but weather, and marveled just the same. The world bewitched, by the late Middle Ages, Europe still hummed with enchantment. For all its prayers and parchments, the continent remained a map of old fears and soft marvels. A man could quote Aristotle in daylight and leave bread for spirits at night. Monks debated logic, while peasants hid charms in their boots. Superstition was not a relic of ignorance. It was the atmosphere of living. The world itself seemed bewitched, alive, and listening. Forests were its lungs, breathing stories through their leaves. Travelers swore that trees whispered at dusk, calling their names with the voices of lost kin. In the Black Forest, people left offerings of milk to the woodwives. Spirits said to guard deer and springs. In Ireland, every hawthorn that grew alone was sacred, belonging to the fair folk. Farmers steered plows around them, for to wound a fairy tree was to invite years of bad luck. On moonlit nights, villagers claimed to see pale figures dancing beneath their branches, silent as smoke. Rivers, too, had temperaments. They could bless or drown, depending on how one greeted them. A fisherman crossing himself before casting his net was not being pious. He was being polite. In France, the Loire was called La Dame du Fleuve, the Lady of the River. In the Baltic, sailors tossed bread into the sea before setting sail, so the water would feed on offerings rather than flesh. The old pagan reverence for nature still murmured beneath Christian hymns, stubborn as rootwork beneath new stone. Even the wind had its rights. When storms gathered, mothers closed windows, not just for safety, but to keep wandering souls from entering. Children were taught to bow slightly when the wind shifted, in case it carried angels or ghosts. In winter, the north wind was said to carry the voices of the unbaptized, crying infants seeking names. Bells tolled low to comfort them, and candles were set on windowsills to guide them home. To live then was to exist between worlds, one visible, one veiled. The church taught of heaven and hell, but ordinary people lived among the shades in between. Fields could remember grief, stones could harbor blessings. A shepherd might touch his cap to a standing stone, murmuring, "Good evening, old one," as though greeting an ancestor. The ground itself felt animate, a vast presence both patient and unpredictable. In towns, magic was less pastoral and more perilous. Fortune-tellers sold their visions for a coin and a palm. Alchemists in smoky cellars searched for ways to transmute metal, not only into gold, but into meaning. They burned mercury and honey, salt and bone, speaking to their ingredients as if coaxing secrets from shy gods. Even learned men, physicians, priests, magistrates, consulted horoscopes before important decisions. The stars still ruled over the law. Meanwhile, the line between miracle and magic blurred dangerously. A saint's relic cured fever. A charm made of herbs did the same. But one was praised and the other feared. Women who brewed healing potions in cottages walked a knife's edge between reverence and accusation. One good harvest earned them thanks. One spoiled loaf earned them suspicion. The same hands that delivered babies could, a season later, be bound for witchcraft. The world bewitched was not kind, but it was intimate. Every object seemed aware of its role. the key that locked away secrets, the knife that demanded sharpening only on holy days, the window that must never face north without a cross above it, shoes placed sole to sole under a bed kept nightmares from entering, a broom laid across the threshold stopped spirits from crossing uninvited. The smallest habits, repeated across generations, wove invisible walls around fragile peace. Travelers carried these customs from valley to valley, trading stories like currency. In taverns, men spoke of ghostly processions seen on hilltops, the wild hunt galloping across the clouds, a cavalcade of the damned and the blessed alike. Some nights it was led by a lost king, other nights by a woman in white, her hair streaming like frost. Those who glimpsed it were warned not to speak, only to kneel and cover their eyes until the sound of hooves passed. Many claimed they still felt the wind of that ride for days, as if eternity had brushed against their cheek. Superstitions bred unity as much as fear. They gave rhythm to uncertainty, meaning to accident. A spilled jug, a cracked plate, a candle that refused to stay lit. None of these were random. They were messages. Life felt coherent precisely because it was full of signs. People did not crave logic. They craved connection. The bewitched world was not haunted. It was companioned. In the manuscripts of scholars and the songs of peasants alike, enchantment and order began to fuse. Theologians tried to categorize angels and spirits, to map the invisible the way they mapped stars. Poets compared the soul to a mirror that reflected heaven imperfectly. Farmers hummed old pagan hymns beneath their breath while harvesting under the cross. The old faith and the new were not enemies but echoes, repeating one another in different tongues. Then quietly, the Renaissance dawned, not as a sunrise, but as a thinning of fog. Printing spread reason. Explorers sailed past the edge of myth. Mathematics tamed the stars. Yet even as the spell of ignorance broke, something precious trembled with it. The world grew clearer, but less enchanted. The stones no longer whispered, and the rivers lost their temper. Silence replaced conversation. Still, fragments endured. People continued to knock on wood, to bless sneezes, to wish on stars. The fair folk retreated to folk tales, but never quite vanished. The habits of a millennium cannot be banished. They fade into instinct. When a candle flickers for no reason, we still look twice. When thunder rolls, we still count the seconds between flash and sound. Somewhere inside, a medieval part of the heart still listens. Because perhaps the world was never truly bewitched, only believed in. And belief, even when half forgotten, is the oldest form of magic. The waning of fear. Morning came slowly to the medieval mind. It wasn't a single dawn, but centuries of pale light seeping through heavy curtains of superstition. The world that once trembled at comets and curses began to lift its eyes, blinking at reason's fragile glow. Fear, that constant companion of the Middle Ages, started to lose its voice, not through conquest, but through exhaustion. By the 15th century, Europe had grown weary of its ghosts. Too many plagues, too many burnings, too many prophecies unfulfilled. The church still thundered about devils, but people had begun to notice how the same prayers often failed, and how the same stars kept rising regardless. They still crossed themselves, still hung herbs and whispered charms, but now, with a trace of irony, a quiet smile, as if indulging an old relative. Art helped first. Painters like Giotto and Van Eyck began to study light, not as symbol, but as reality. The divine glow that once blinded saints now illuminated skin and stone. Faces grew human. Shadows obeyed laws instead of mystery. A new way of seeing was also a new way of thinking. If light could be measured, perhaps so could truth. In the cities, merchants and travelers spread fresh ideas faster than any sermon. They brought not relics but books, manuscripts copied from ancient Greece and Arabia, where scholars had never stopped asking why. Trade ships carried pepper, silk, and geometry, At night, by lamplight, men compared notes on medicine and navigation instead of miracles. The world expanded, and so did the mind. Even faith adjusted. The church, though slower than the sea, could feel the tide turning. Priests spoke more of charity than of curses, more of conscience than of fear. Heaven remained, but hell retreated into metaphor. The devil, once blamed for every misfortune, became less an adversary and more an explanation that people no longer needed. When a storm broke a roof, they fixed the roof instead of flogging their sins. Universities flourished. Scholars like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon dared to suggest that observation might please God as much as prayer. To study creation was to praise its maker. A monk could chart the stars without losing his soul. A physician could dissect without defiance. Reason was no longer rebellion. It was devotion translated into curiosity. But superstition did not die easily. It hid in corners, in gestures, in habit. A scholar might test a magnet, SE pull in daylight, and still refuse to spill salt at dinner. Even Galileo, staring through his telescope at the moons of Jupiter, crossed himself before writing down his findings. Faith and fear coexisted like two old monks who had quarreled so long they forgot why. The witch trials, paradoxically, grew fiercest just as belief began to weaken. In their cruelty, they were the final shudder of an age realizing its own decline. As printing spread literacy, it also spread panic. Pamphlets of demons and pacts, illustrated manuals for recognizing witches. The new rational tools were wielded for old irrational ends. It was fear's dying flail, as brutal as it was absurd, but death throes always sound loudest before silence. Gradually, the tone of the world changed. In place of dread came wonder. Scientists spoke of gravity, anatomy, and optics, invisible forces that did not punish but explained. Alchemists became chemists. Astrologers turned astronomers. The same men who once whispered spells now whispered formulas. And the stars, far from angels' lanterns, became suns themselves, worlds within worlds. It was not less beautiful, only less afraid. Yet even as fear waned, something softer took its place, melancholy. People began to miss the old intimacy with mystery. The universe grew larger but lonelier. A charm that once protected a household was replaced by a theory that protected nothing. The night sky, once alive with omens, now seemed silent and cold. The world was safer, but less enchanted. Humanity had exorcised its demons and, in doing so, perhaps a few of its dreams. Still, not all the magic vanished. The human heart, unable to live on reason alone, smuggled superstition into new shapes. Poets replaced priests, love replaced relics, beauty became the new miracle. The same awe once reserved for saints' bones now found itself in sunsets, in music, in the quiet perfection of a snowflake. The divine slipped from cathedrals into consciousness, hiding not in thunder, but in thought. By the dawn of the Renaissance, fear had become an echo, faint, familiar, occasionally useful. People still knocked on wood, still crossed fingers, still whispered blessings, but now as gestures of affection rather than terror. The old habits had softened into superstition's afterlife, tradition, a shared memory of danger transformed into comfort. If you walked through a market square in that new light, you'd still see fragments of the old world, a charm on a merchant S-neck, a holy medal pinned to a child's sleeve, a woman muttering over herbs. But the difference was subtle, not submission, but nostalgia. Fear had grown tired, and with it, the need for monsters. And so, after 1,000 years of trembling, Europe began to breathe differently. The same bells that once drove away storms now marked hours of work and leisure. The same moon that once ruled madness now ruled calendars. The same stars that once prophesied kings now guided sailors. The world had not lost its wonder. It had learned to look for it elsewhere. When people finally began to speak of progress, they did so quietly, as if afraid to wake what still lingered in the dark. And in truth, the darkness never left completely. It only learned new names: coincidence, chance, fate. The vocabulary changed, but the need to understand the unknown remained, for fear never truly disappears. It only becomes gentler, wearing the clothes of caution, curiosity, and prayer. The old world of omens and miracles dissolved into memory, but the human heart, faithful to its longing, still listens for whispers in the wind and finds, every now and then, a reason to believe. Echoes in the modern mind centuries have passed since the last bell tolled to drive away a storm. The plowshares have rusted. The cathedrals stand as echoes of their own hymns, and yet the medieval world has not truly gone. Its breath lingers in us still, in gestures, in words, in the small reflexes that outlive reason. Somewhere inside every modern soul, a faint medieval pulse beats, cautious, reverent, and strangely tender. You can hear it in the way we knock on wood before speaking of good fortune, a whisper of the old belief that spirits dwell in trees. You can see it in the way we cross our fingers, mimicking the sign of the cross once drawn against devils. Even science, that proud child of the Renaissance, still carries superstition's shadow. Astronauts refuse to launch on Fridays. Surgeons avoid uttering success before an operation. Logic built our world, but habit still guards it. The medieval mind sought safety in signs. We, for all our progress, do the same. Only the symbols have changed. Where once a charm of herbs hung over a cradle, now it's a hospital bracelet or a lucky stuffed animal. Where once villagers watched the flight of crows, now we check the weather forecast or the stock market with the same nervous reverence. We pretend it's data, but the feeling, that trembling curiosity about the unseen, remains identical. Every superstition was, at its heart, a form of care. To light a candle, to tie a knot, to whisper a prayer, all were ways of saying, I want this fragile life to continue, and that yearning has never left us. We may scoff at charms, but we still make wishes at 11:11. We may no longer believe in witches, yet we talk of toxic energy, of bad vibes, of the universe sending signs. The language has changed, not the longing. Museums now hold the relics of fear, talismans of bone and brass, dried herbs wrapped in cloth, rings inscribed with broken Latin. Visitors peer through glass at them with fascination, never realizing how close they still are. The same need that carved those charms still beats beneath wristwatches and wedding bands, beneath tattoos inked for luck or remembrance. We are never far from the old spells. We have only renamed them as sentiment. Even religion, tempered by centuries of doubt, carries superstition's gentler residue. Candles still flicker in chapels. Incense still curls toward vaulted ceilings. People still kneel, still whisper to the invisible. Faith has grown quieter, more personal, but its rhythm remains, the same as it was when monks counted prayers with beads, when peasants counted hopes with stars. There is comfort in continuity. To imagine that everything ancient was ignorance is to forget how fear once held humanity together. The peasants who traced crosses in the dust, who left bread on windowsills for spirits, who whispered charms to children, they were not fools. They were the architects of reassurance. Their world was perilous and brief, but they faced it with ritual instead of despair. And we, in our more polished age, still build the same small shelters, out of habits, hopes, and words. Modern science explains what the medieval world could only fear. Lightning is no longer God's anger, disease no longer the devil's breath. Yet explanation doesn't erase emotion. We still stare at storms, transfixed. We still whisper before tests and journeys. The old awe remains, stripped of theology, but not of wonder. Perhaps superstition was never error, only poetry written in the language of survival. Somewhere tonight, a man glances at the moon and feels something ancient stir. That quiet sense of being watched by something vast and patient. A woman pauses before an empty chair, feeling that absence hum with presence. A child tosses salt over a shoulder, smiling though he cannot say why. These are the remnants of a millennium's imagination, still walking beside us like friendly ghosts. The medieval world taught its people that every shadow meant something. The modern world tells us shadows mean nothing, and yet we still look. The truth lies somewhere in between, not in the fear, but in the attention. To believe that the universe notices us, even faintly, is to feel less alone. So perhaps superstition endures not because it deceives, but because it comforts. It reminds us that mystery is not our enemy, it's our oldest companion. We can measure the heavens, trace the atom, and still light a candle when the wind sounds strange. Knowledge and faith, once rivals, now sit quietly side by side, sharing the same small flame. And as the centuries turn, the echoes of those old beliefs grow softer, but never vanish. Every whisper, every ritual, every half-forgotten charm is part of one long conversation between fear and hope, between darkness and dawn, between the human heart and the great unanswerable night. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of modern noise, you can still hear it, the faint toll of a distant bell rolling through time, carrying not warning, but wonder. So settle back. Let the past rest where it belongs, not in ignorance, but in memory. The world is quieter now, though never silent. The superstitions of our ancestors have become the poetry of our own thoughts. And somewhere, in the calm between heartbeat and breath, the old world still whispers its final benediction. The world remembers you.